Remember how kind of dystopian things were a couple episodes back? Here's something that might help solve that problem and make a lot of things better along the way. Welcome to the Mutual Aid episode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer.
Now, you're probably wondering, what is mutual aid? And why is this coming up on a Heathen podcast? The answer to that is mutual aid is a concept that, as I'll explain later on in this episode, is deeply embedded in the surviving source material, as well as human nature more broadly. Mutual aid is both the tendency that exists within human societies throughout history to come together, help each other out, and provide assistance for those who are in need in disasters and other similar circumstances, often without prompting or coercion, but simply because these were things that needed to be done and had to happen. The concept of mutual aid builds on this tendency for people to band together in times of crisis and emergency. The theory of mutual aid in this sense is that human society and communities can be built on this shared desire for people to help each other, support each other, and create mutually beneficial, abundant, and sustaining frameworks for life. One of the most well-known articulations of this concept, along with a lot of examples, was written by the Russian naturalist, theorist, exile, and revolutionary Pyotr Kropotkin in the book titled Mutual Aid. Kropotkin's argument rested on his experiences as a naturalist in what was then Russian Siberia. While he was conducting research in these harsh conditions, he noted frequently how animals both of the same species and sometimes of different species found ways to cooperate and support each other so that they could survive and thrive in the difficult and at times forbidding conditions that made up Russian Siberia. Kropotkin was not the only theorist to note this, by the way. Charles Darwin, in his Origin of Species, describes mutual aid as a critical evolutionary impulse, one that became buried by the survival of the fittest meme that was particularly promoted by social Darwinists and others who wanted new excuses for people with power to be shitty and awful to people who did not have power. This, by the way, was a concept that Darwin strongly opposed, and within the Russian school of naturalists that Kropotkin was a part of, the mutual aid impulse was emphasized much more strongly than competition between species. The late Stephen Jay Gould and David Graeber also wrote extensively on mutual aid. Gould's writings were informed by his training and experience as an evolutionary biologist, while Graeber's focused much more on social examples throughout human history, including to an extent prehistory and less recorded aspects of history, as is fitting with somebody with his particular kind of anthropological training and background. David Graeber's posthumously published The Dawn of Everything has a lot of excellent examples of mutual aid in different human societies from around the world throughout history. More practically, there are legions of examples of mutual aid responses and organizing throughout history, with natural disasters and crises being the greatest examples of mutual aid in action. What's especially powerful about these examples is they strongly contradict a lot of assumptions we have about the way people work and how society works. One idea, for example, that tends to be pretty common is that people will go to pieces and panic and completely lose it, turning into a scramble of all against all in times of natural disaster and crisis. Yet, when we actually get into those circumstances, it tends to be the opposite that happens, and people rapidly pull together and find ways to help each other out. What I'm going to do with this episode is break down both the what of mutual aid in some very broad strokes, because there's whole libraries of material on this stuff, and why pagan and heathen communities need to be having this conversation, both about what mutual aid is and what we can better do to cultivate it within our spaces and for each other. I'm going to break this down over the next just under an hour into 4 chunks. The first is, just to get right to it, why we need to be having this conversation and why current circumstances call for mutual aid. I will then get into some very recent mutual aid success stories, namely those of worldwide COVID-19 mutual aid response groups and the Oregon 2020 wildfire relief actions by mutual aid networks in the state of Oregon. From there, I will get into why mutual aid is justified from a heathen perspective and how there are examples in surviving source material that support both the actions and the broader concept of mutual aid as being a key component of modern spiritual practice. And finally, I will get into what we can do now and how we can take this from a conversation to reality, or at least get the first few steps going. I do want to take a moment to thank my patrons whose generous support has helped sustain this podcast and all of my other work, including things like an upcoming book and a whole lot more. If you like what you're hearing and want to help support inclusive, radical heathen organizing, then please head on over to my Patreon. $5 a month gets you advanced access to podcast episodes and increasing benefits as support grows. So please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer and throw the cost of a cup of Starbucks in the tin.
Now, I'm sure folks tuning in are wondering, why get into this topic and why now? More generally, I think there is a lot of material and basis within heathen and broader pagan spiritual practices for incorporating mutual aid into our different communities and the broader movement. And I'll get into this more a bit later, because I think the other reason why now is more pressing and worth getting right into. We are living in what could be described as interesting times, or as it is described in some corners of the internet, the cool zone, meaning we are now in those segments of history that are going to make for very interesting history books for future students, and not because they were good or easy times to be living in. In times like these, it is often helpful for communities to build alternatives to existing institutions and social systems that can support them during these times of instability and uncertainty. One of the most immediate reasons why heathens, pagans, and folks in other adjacent communities are going to need mutual aid in the very near future is because of the oncoming, for lack of a better term, everything panic. The moral panic that's building up around queer rights, trans rights, the attack on abortion rights, and the advancing of Christian nationalism and a very public, aggressive kind of Christianity that seems equally emboldened and desperate enough to make a play at imposing minority, right-wing, reactionary Christian rule over whole societies that will be enforced by the use of terror and persecution of any populations that don't fall in line. At the heart of this entire push is what could be best described as a siege mentality, meaning the groups who are the core constituencies of this movement, which have been increasingly saturated in an all-encompassing conspiracy theory that takes elements of pretty much every other racist, sexist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic conspiracy theory and bundles them all together into, I guess you could call, sort of an everything conspiracy that combines great replacement theory, claiming that the Jews are out to replace white people through immigration, with anti-abortion rhetoric that sees abortion as a campaign to eliminate white Christian families, see the existence of LGBT people as a product of a conspiracy to groom children and seduce them away from proper godly gender roles and all that jazz. Like, this is just sort of the tip of the rabbit hole. There's a lot more room to go, and I don't really want to go down into all the nooks and crannies of it, but suffice to say, this is a movement that is being motivated by this belief that the entire modern world is out to get them and wipe out their way of life and will not tolerate their existence. So therefore, it's necessary to take everything back from the degenerates, the unrighteous, the non-Christian, and so on, and impose God's kingdom on earth. There are many ways that we can already see in the world that these groups are actively whipping up a moral panic through things like, the groomer narrative and critical race theory and a whole bunch of other similar stuff that will justify wiping out anything they see as a threat. The best way to overcome that is for our own communities to build resilience and support structures, to reach out to other groups that are doing the same thing and help stand together despite the risk and the growing danger. We are also living in times of incredible social, economic, and ecological upheaval. COVID-19 has killed millions of people around the world, 1 million people alone in the United States, and is still actively with us. The global economy is still experiencing its worst period of disruption in terms of supply chains, core commodities, and all kinds of other things that impact absolutely everything, including the price of bread and gas and everything in between, since the 1970s. And given the state of corporate debt, zombie firms, and real estate markets, it's quite likely that current circumstances will get a lot worse. So it is going to become extremely necessary for everybody, regardless of what communities you're in, to be working with mutual aid groups and getting in contact with those kind of organizations, or organizing them, or at least even thinking about that stuff now, while things are comparatively not as bad as they are likely to get in the very near future. Climate change is also going to lead to increasingly erratic weather events, natural disasters, and more. Large chunks of Europe and North America right now, for example, are experiencing record-setting temperatures, hitting in places that often don't have systems like air conditioning or architecture that is designed to help mitigate the effects of extreme heat and provide relief. The power grid for the state of Texas, which is, a region slightly larger than the country of France, is experiencing intermittent brownouts and blackouts because the power grid that was already badly damaged by extreme cold is now being taxed by the needs of a grid facing extreme heat. Instability, uncertainty, and deprivation are likely to become more rather than less common as time passes and events progress. This, by the way, is the consensus of climate scientists, environmental economists, and other specialists who have spent their entire lives asking and answering questions of what happens when climate changes in ways that are disruptive to how we as human beings in human society have existed and expect things to exist. There's no shortage of reasons why members of the pagan and heathen communities should be looking to concepts like mutual aid networks, and survival programs, both for our own sake and so we can help those who are around us. As much as this all is legitimately scary and intimidating, cultivating mutual aid should not just be seen as an absolute grim necessity because times are forcing it upon us. It can also mean a reinvigoration of community and a rebuilding of social connections and social bonds that are often strained or even sundered in the society we live in, particularly in these tumultuous times. Mutual aid doesn't mean a bunch of survivalists stockpiling beans, bullets, and band-aids in their basements and bunkers. It means community gardens. It means making the phrase, "it takes a village," a reality instead of an aspiration. And it means fostering a healthy form of interdependence. It also means, as some examples that I'm going to get into show, that you and your community have much more agency in navigating life, facing challenges, and developing alternatives to the problems that we are all facing. It's work, no question, but it's the kind of work that leaves everyone better for it. One of the best recent examples of the effectiveness of mutual aid as an emergency response, as well as a model for community and social support, is in the wave of COVID-19 related mutual aid and community groups that sprung up throughout the world in response to the pandemic and lockdown orders. As I'm sure a lot of folks can remember, in many places during the early days of the lockdowns, there was something of a sense of everybody being in this together and needing to help each other out. Things like stories of neighbors staying in touch by writing messages on poster board and holding them up in their windows across to each other, including messages of care and support. Assistance for more vulnerable populations, parent groups coming together to figure out ways to get their kids through education during lockdown. There's just too many examples to list off just the sheer range of mutual aid and spontaneous community care that emerged during the early days of the pandemic. Of course, all of this is anecdotal experience or specific reports of individual cases, which on its own is not enough to say that mutual aid as a trend was a significant and possibly decisive factor in helping to mitigate and contain the pandemic. There are, however, studies that have been done since the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic into the role of mutual aid groups in the COVID-19 pandemic response. One good example of this is a paper titled "Let Communities Do Their Work: The Role of Mutual Aid and Self-Help Groups in the COVID-19 Pandemic Response," and link is included in the show description. This paper studied the impact of mutual aid in Kenya, the occupied Palestinian territories, the Philippines, and Sudan. These places were chosen in part because the researchers had pre-existing relationships with established aid groups and other similar organizations in the regions. What I'm quoting now is one of their findings on the efficacy of mutual aid in these cases. Quote, In contrast to much of the government and aid sector support that followed in some cases, citizen and community-led responses were fast and flexible. They did not have to wait for proposals and funding approval processes, upon which bigger actors are largely dependent. Much spontaneous mutual aid happened within hours and days, while established bodies often needed weeks or months to get responses underway. It remains impossible to quantify properly this early outpouring of mutual aid, care, kindness, and voluntary redistribution of resources, but all indicators point to it having a very significant scale and impact across the globe. It was crucial not only in the period needed by governments and the aid sector to mount their responses, but also later when it continued to help fill unavoidable gaps in activities by these larger entities. In several cases, the latter were able to build on and take advantage of their experiences harnessed by mutual aid and other grassroots initiatives as their more institutionalized responses gathered speed. As Matthewman and Ukusa concluded in their paper, community groups often succeed where governments fail. Reporting by Cal Matters from October 2020 on COVID mutual aid groups shows a similar pattern in the state of California, where at time of writing, there were over 40 COVID-19 mutual aid groups that have been organized by community members, students, longtime organizers, and others to redistribute food, masks, and other necessary resources to people who needed them most. One example of the scope and scale of these operations is from Mutual Aid Network LA, which at time of writing in this article, which is also linked in the show notes, had raised over $500,000 on GoFundMe since being formed in March of the same year and had amassed hundreds of volunteers. Similar effort partnered with a local community farm in Riverside County to distribute over 1,000 meals to Riverside residents at time of writing and had raised over $5,200. There was also a similar mutual aid project by students centered around UC Berkeley who put their engineering and scientific knowledge to the task of building air filters and other similar devices when wildfires effectively turned the sky black for about a week in the state of California, and breathing became a serious issue for a while there. Yeah, 2020 was kind of wild when you think about it. One similar concern that's expressed in the Cal Matters article is that of filling in the cracks left by existing institutions. As Riverside Mutual Aid Network Aram Ira described in the Cal Matters article, one major concern at time of writing, which unfortunately has been sort of validated, was the lack of any new economic relief packages coming from the state legislature or from the U.S. Congress. Many of these projects are still up and active, though operating at diminished scale compared to what was seen in 2020. Mutual aid groups didn't just provide immediate relief, they also provided what another study described as social cure. In this study, titled How Participation in COVID-19 Mutual Aid Groups Affects Subjective Well-Being and How Political Identity Moderates These Effects, researchers studied the development and participation in COVID-19 mutual aid groups that had formed in the United Kingdom. They specifically studied the case of 14 community groups that have been organized by the community union Acorn. Social cure, according to these researchers, is a phenomenon where participation in social and community affairs leads to positive psychological outcomes for the people who are participating in them. Things like a greater sense of well-being, purpose, place, and having a sense of meaning in their lives. This study, which was again published in October 2021, found that one of the key features sustaining mutual aid groups after the lockdowns ended was this social cure phenomena, where people who were engaging in mutual aid projects found them to be psychologically fulfilling and enriching. As they conclude, quote, COVID-19 mutual aid groups have served two crucial functions in the pandemic. First, they have met the emotional and material needs of those requiring support. Specifically, the challenges of self-isolation would be impossible without the support provided by mutual aid groups and others. Second, our analysis shows these groups have served to enhance the well-being of the volunteers themselves. Our findings on the well-being effects of providing support are probably not unique to mutual aid groups. Rather, our argument is that participation in mutual aid during disasters appears to be one context in which social cure processes are instantiated. In addition, these processes differed based on the different activities that the participants engaged in. Those who engaged in more individualistic ways reaped benefits which were unrelated to their social identity, while those who possessed a shared identity were able to access benefits such as feelings of connection, camaraderie, and empowerment. In short, there is a significant body of research, journalism, and other material which affirms that anecdotal sense of mutual aid and community care flourishing throughout the world despite the disaster that was unfolding. These spontaneous, self-organized care and support groups were essential in making lockdown livable and making it possible for many communities, particularly in more remote or less resourced areas, to survive. Mutual aid was also psychologically quite beneficial and healthy for people. It reestablished connections, it got people back in their communities, and in doing so, it fostered that greater sense of camaraderie and empowerment, to again quote the study of UK mutual aid groups. These mutual aid groups were also not limited to the pandemic. In the state of Oregon, where wildfires were especially severe during the year 2020, mutual aid groups sprung up throughout the state. And while there were many instances of far-right militants like the Proud Boys harassing and disrupting these mutual aid projects, they nonetheless were invaluable for helping people evacuate from affected areas, find them housing, provide food and financial support, and whatever else it was that they needed. These efforts were supported by local activist groups, restaurants, and other businesses who donated their time, resources, and expertise to assist in the relief effort. And a link with some examples of this is also, again, included in the show notes. None of this required someone in a position of official power or authority to come down and say this needs to happen. People did this on their own and effectively met many of these demands, while more official institutions and responses steadily mobilized their resources. Going into these recent examples of mutual aid lays a foundation for understanding examples of mutual aid in the surviving source material that many heathen groups use as the basis for our spiritual practices. The best place to start is with hospitality. The hospitality customs of the Nordic peoples are extremely well documented, particularly in the Havamal, one of the sagas that makes up the poetic Edda. Most of the first third of this poem is dedicated just to how you should treat guests when they are in your home, and how you should behave as a guest. What is particularly interesting about these discussions is the implicit assumption throughout these verses is hospitality is something you offer to people who are in need of it. There's no mention or concerns about potential situations where someone may be seen as less deserving or unworthy, or for whatever other reason not to be extended the protection of hospitality. It is also very well documented in surviving historical sources, folklore, and many other places of how important hospitality was for the Nordic peoples. We even have an entire saga in the Poetic Edda, the Grimnismal, which is about what happens when you don't abide by these things. In that saga, there is a cruel king who enjoys Odin's support, and crucially is also known for being greedy and miserly with his resources. Frigga knows about this and approaches Odin saying, look, this guy is a problem, and Odin basically rebuffs Frigg, saying, no, this is someone who has my support. I'm sure he is a good and noble man. So she makes a pact with Odin, asking him to go down in disguise to truly see what this king is like. She also asks the goddess Saga to go ahead and inform this king that there is a potentially disreputable traveler who will be coming upon his hall. So, Frigga kind of sets up Odin a little bit here. Either way, Odin arrives in disguise, and upon his arrival is promptly thrown into the king's dungeon, where he then engages with extended dialogue with the king's son, shares with him many crucial secrets of Nordic myth, and then, after doing all of this, reveals himself as Odin and then proclaims a doom of death upon the cruel king, who then immediately falls upon a spear because of Odin's magic and intervention. Key to Odin's decision is the king, contrary to what would be expected of hospitality, treated Odin as a dangerous enemy and threw him into the dungeon, thus confirming what had been said regarding his cruelty and his hospitality, rather his serious lack thereof. There are compelling material reasons for why these kind of customs would emerge within Nordic Scandinavia. Life on the road, away from the supports and resources of your home community in early medieval Scandinavia, was a very dangerous place to be. Anyone expecting to engage in any amount of travel in this world would likely, at some point or another in their life, find themselves in a position where they were in need of the assistance of strangers. This knowledge encouraged, I think, a kind of reciprocity of where everyone knows it's in their interests to offer assistance to people who they meet on the road or who are traveling, because they may one day be in the same position. There does, however, seem to be more than just, that kind of cold, self-interest oriented calculation that would go into the creation and sustenance of the hospitality culture that existed in pre-Christian Nordic Scandinavia. Care for others and that feeling of completeness that comes from being around others and being in community with other people seems to also have been a factor, as is best demonstrated in Havamal 47, which in the Bellows translation reads as, "Young was I once and wandered alone, and not of the road I knew. Rich did I feel when a comrade I'm found, for man is man's delight." In other words, social cure. These customs also went hand in hand with a greater set of assumptions that people who had resources and had wealth were expected to be generous with it. One of the best verses summarizing that in the Havamal is verse 48, which reads, "The lives of the brave and noble are best, sorrows they seldom feed, but the coward fear of all things feels, and gladly not the greedy gives." Rulers and leaders who were generous with their resources were frequently praised in the sagas and other surviving source materials, while those who were known for taking from the people who were under their power and hoarding resources were often looked on poorly, such as Harald Hardrada, a later king of Norway whose name Hardrada means hard ruler. Sacrificial feasts, as described in the Heimskringla, served not just a religious purpose, but also a redistributive one, where people from the communities that were participating in these feasts
received the richness of the sacrificial meats that were offered up, meats that often would have represented great expense and cost for any of these particular families. Kings, jarls, and other community figures would also use these feasts as an opportunity to redistribute their wealth among their followers, as a way of reinforcing these social bonds and providing support for those who they saw as under their power and within their community. This is echoed in myth by Odin's ring Draupnir, which is described as a great arm ring that regularly on every 9th day spawns 8 other copies of itself, which Odin then gives out as gifts to the other gods. What is especially intriguing from a mythic standpoint, however, is this verse from the Voluspa, which suggests an awareness, at least at the time of when the Poetic Eddas were compiled, of several different forms of social organization and means of wealth redistribution. As the verse reads from the Bellows translation, "Then sought the gods their assembly seats, the holy ones in council held, whether the gods should tribute give, or to all alike should worship belong." In other words, the ways that they have of distributing resources, which in this context is coming after the war between the Aesir and the Vanir, is either one of resources being given from one by the other, which of course then is redistributed as per the different customs of things like Odin's sharing of his ring, feasts, and the like, or some kind of collective sharing of all these resources, and the worship offered by the peoples in Midgard. What is intriguing is that these are the solutions that are offered, either inclusion or some form of gifting that ultimately would still be redistributed based on other customs that existed. This sharing of goods and desire for an almost peaceful, even utopian abundance is also present earlier in the Voluspa, as it reads in verse 8, "In their dwellings at peace they played at tables. Of gold no lack did the gods then know, till thither came up giant mates 3, huge of might, out of Jotunheim." That last part refers to the 3 Norns, or at least most likely refers to the 3 greater Norns. And what's interesting is the rest of that is taking place after the new world has been made from Ymir, and the ideal is everybody has more than enough, and everyone is in a place of plenty and rest, and nothing is oriented around accumulating the wealth and power of one at the expense of others. To bring things back to Earth, so to speak, you're probably wondering how, short of killing a cosmic giant, can we get to these kind of systems of mutual aid and cultivate these ties that can give our community and other communities close to us the strength to endure and flourish despite the conditions that we are all currently facing in the world. The best place to start is just reading up on examples of active mutual aid groups. It'sGoingDown.com is a great place for news and information on new mutual aid projects. And if you're looking for larger scale projects to learn from, one great place to start would be Cooperation Jackson, which has built on the concepts of mutual aid into developing local cooperative economics and alternatives for people living in Jackson, Mississippi. Many of the COVID-19 mutual aid groups and disaster response groups that started in 2020 and earlier are great places to reach out to. Many COVID mutual aid groups are still active, with one Guardian report finding an estimated 40% of UK mutual aid groups, so that's 4 in 10, continue to be active in their communities. If there's ways that you can plug in and help out, then do whatever it is that you can and whatever works best with these existing networks. That both helps build these strong alternatives for any community that might need it, and can also be a great way to learn as you go from already existing best practices. You should also start talking about mutual aid in your local spiritual communities, whether that's with, say, a Unitarian church through the Covenant of Unitarian Universalist Pagans, or an active pagan group in person, or an online or Discord group. Regardless of the nature of your community, that is the best place for these conversations to really get started and continue. Because if we're going to be doing any of those things, if elements of the community are going to be finding ways to come together and support each other, then it has to start with talking about it and understanding the concept of mutual aid and why we may need it in the very near future. If your particular community is already doing some kind of mutual aid, then sharing what it is that you do and how you do it can help others who are on the same wavelength but maybe are a step or two behind get started faster and more smoothly. Being able to point to pagan and heathen examples of mutual aid will help others in the community understand and adopt these practices. Basically, the more who do it, the more are likely to get involved and the more effective we all can be for each other and the world around us. One project that's come out of the Fire and Ice community in that direction is the Heathen Cookbook, which you can find at onblackwings.com. It is a listing of known mutual aid groups in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. And for now, it mostly includes a lot of information on COVID relief groups, but does also have information on the National Bail Fund Network for the United States. The cookbook is a living guide, so if you have information on groups or organizations who are doing some of these different services that we're looking for information on, please send in whatever you have to cookbook@onblackwings.com. We also accept do-it-yourself guides on topics like home repair, food cultivation, permaculture, basic survival skills, on whatever else you think is relevant and is worth sharing through the Heathen Cookbook. So yeah, these are all things that you can do to help start the conversation, to learn from others, to share your experiences, and help get mutual aid within the pagan and heathen communities, as well as more broadly in the world, become more of a thing. We all only do better when we help each other. And the more we can find ways to do that and to leverage our skills, our unique talents, our particular perspectives and experiences in ways that build better community, that make better orlog for everyone around us, is worth doing. One final thought I would like to close on in that vein is just to dwell for a moment from the heathen perspective on what you could see as the opposite of the spirit and concept of mutual aid. And this can be found as one of the first of the events noted in Ragnarok for the Voluspa. Now I'm going to quote here again from Bellows for a minute. Brothers shall fight and fell each other, and sisters' sons shall kinship stain. Hard it is on earth with mighty abandon. Axe time, sword time, shields are sundered. Wind time, wolf time, ere the world falls, nor shall men each other spare. In other words, one of the early signs of Ragnarok is a complete breakdown of any sense of community or shared humanity. The collapse of systems of mutual support and mutual benefit in favor of a war of all against all. If mutual aid and what it supports could be seen as the furthest thing from the wolf age of Ragnarok, then I can think of no better antidote for preventing the kinds of horrific events described in the Voluspa than supporting and building a powerful antidote to the fears, uncertainties, and wants that have time and again throughout history helped set people at each other's throats. So yeah, this has been the mutual aid episode. I want to thank everybody for listening, and I particularly want to give a big thank you to all of my patrons. Your support is what helps keep this podcast on the air and helps sustain the rest of my work. I could not do this without you. If you are interested in supporting this podcast and the rest of the various good trouble that I tend to get up to, please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets everybody advanced access to this podcast and growing benefits like monthly live Q&As and more as support grows. So once again, thank you all so much for listening. This has been Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer.